Welcome, everyone. This is a chance for all of us to celebrate the accomplishments and contributions of David Marsden over his long years of participation in the SASE organization. We're not going to even try to attempt to address his scientific contributions. That will be done in a conference in the fall, I believe, organized by Sarah Ashwin. She may say something about that when she steps forward. There is a call for that. I'm Karen Shire. For the last 4 years, I have organized the Network G with David Marsden. And as you all know, it was just days before we began our virtual conference last year that we learned that he was admitted into hospital for treatment, and a very short time afterwards that we very tragically lost him. And we all have suffered, none of us more than Alice Lamb, his wife, and Anthony, his son, who are with us today for this tribute. This should be a celebration, and we've planned it as such. I've invited scholars from different countries who can speak to David's contributions to employment relations, employment studies throughout the world. Not all of them can be with us today. In a few statements I'll read myself. I've also invited some of the persons who have been his students, who have been mentored to him as junior professors or junior researchers, and who were his colleagues. And finally, I will ask some people who have been very involved in the SASE organization over many years and can speak to his accomplishments to finish up. David, as you know, was president of SASE. He was one of the founders of the Socio-Economic Review. He founded Network G, which this year is the largest. Usually it's going between second largest and largest. And in that capacity, he has always been extremely inclusive, very interdisciplinary in the reach of his work. He's influenced all of our disciplines, I think, at SASE. And I especially welcome the way in which he was methodologically pluralistic and did his best to make junior researchers, young researchers, PhD researchers feel very at home and at ease in this organization. And this is a legacy that I think all of us are committed to carrying forth into the future. I'll begin with those who have known David as somebody contributing to their own countries, and because David spent a lot of time in France, I think I would like to begin with Jérôme Gautié, if he's here. I should just warn you, we are being live streamed. That means that if you would at some later when we have time like to say something yourself, I do have to ask you to stand up and use a microphone. So, yeah, Jérôme.
Thank you very much, Karen. Well, it's quite moving to be the first one to speak about David. Well, David has very strong ties with France, I would say, both intellectual and personal ties. He spoke French fluently. He wrote directly in French. That was quite impressive. And he had a great impact on the industrial relations in France. And remember that industrial relations in France are not a separate field, so it's fragmented between economists, sociologists, political scientists, human resource management scholars. And he was able to speak to all of them, and he knew a lot and very well the French contribution to these fields. David had come as a research fellow in 1974. For 1 year in the LEST, the Laboratoire d'économie et sociologie du travail in Aix. And it was, I think, a very important experience for him. And in a way, he never left the LEST. Well, he came back to the United Kingdom, of course, but intellectually, he never left the LEST. He ended by defending a PhD in the LEST in the early 80s. And he kept on collaborating with LEST researchers during many years, and he was involved in many collective research programs with less researchers. At that time, in the 70s, 80s, the left was quite famous, even at European level, because it was the birthplace of the so-called societal effect approach. I think maybe Jackie is here, but in her presidential address, she mentioned this approach, which was one of the contingency theories that contested the theory of convergence of capitalist economies towards a single model. And of course, David was influenced by this theory, and his PhD supervisor, François Sellier, was one of the leader of this societal approach in the left, and one of the co-authors of the famous book on the comparison between France and Germany. But he brought also a lot of original, I would say, theoretical and empirical material. So in his PhD was published directly in French in 1989 under the title "The Labor Markets, the Social Limits of New Theories." The English translation, and really it became a reference in the field. It even for students. I was a student at that time. It even became the main textbook on labor because there were not so many in France at that time, and it was the only one that was able to combine neoclassical theories and institutional inspired, I would say, theories. And he was a master, I would say, in being able of re-embedding labor neoclassical mechanism, I would say, in their institutional underpinnings that made them possible and shaped them differently in different historical and institutional contexts. So it was a really illuminating book for many of us. And at the same period, at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, with his left colleagues, notably François Hérault and Jean-Jacques Sylvestre, he published also a very important article in the International Labour Review on the comparison between UK and France and the role of internal labour markets and occupational labour markets. Okay, and this was really also illuminating article. Because he combined in this article, so to say, the legacy of the Clark Kerr, Peter Doringer, and Michael Pure contribution on the segmentation theory and internal labor markets with the societal approach. Okay, and it was really a powerful article that allows to understand the differences in employment relations and the labor markets in the different countries. And I will stop very soon because only 5 minutes, but I will finish by saying that after those contributions that were really influential in France, he kept on collaborating, as I said. He never stopped working on comparisons, including France, and especially on pay systems. And I say he never stopped being an intellectual reference in the French industrial relational field, and for institutionally minded, I would say, labor economists, and also a lot of sociologists in the industrial relations. So thank you, David.
I'll now ask Wenzel Matiaske to speak about David in Germany. Just cancel it.
Just cancel it. Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity to say some words about David in a German context. Well, in the context of SASE, of course, our memory is directly linked to the network he organized for us over the years. And I don't have too often the opportunity to join the network, but when I joined it was always like homecomings with David as our host. And some of his work, his intellectual work, is already highlighted. I don't want to speak about that. I only want to say some words about his significance for German industrial relations and human resource management community, because he is for a long time linked to this community. And I would also like to bring the sadness greetings of his friends and companions from Germany. Well,
Maybe just a little bit closer to the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
Wenzel.
Okay. 30 years ago, the German Journal of Industrial Relations was founded, and David was one of the founding editors. He founded it together with Walter Müller-Jentsch, Dieter Sadowski, Jörg Sudo, and others, and in cooperation with Rainer Hamp, our editor and publisher. In this field of research, different disciplines meet: economics, sociology, law, management, sometimes psychology. And these are disciplines which not always understand each other. Furthermore, it's to mention who knows this group of people, these are strong personalities. So it was a challenging task to manage this journal. And this requires not only a broad view about the disciplines, the understanding of different theoretical perspectives about different methods and traditions in method, but also foresight to shape the interdisciplinary field, to connect issues and people. And that was David's strength. He brought all that to the table of the journal. In addition, he had the rare gift of a sharp judgment, paired with constructive support and kindness of tone. He never read an unkind line. Dieter Sadowski writes about his friend some weeks ago, neither as an editor nor as an anonymous reviewer. After 7 years, this group hands over to the next group, and this is not the only rule which the group brings to us. Up to now, the editorial team of Industrial Relations discusses not only the paper which are handed in, but also every decision we make and every editorial letter is discussed in the group. I think that is also a heritage of David. Through the journal, David was also on board of the trustees of the Institute for Labor Law and Industrial Relations at the University of Trier for a long time. He participated in many workshops for PhDs, etc. He contributes reports about sometimes challenging academic decisions. Most recently, we had the pleasure to meet David in a conference, unfortunately only virtual due to the COVID crisis in Hamburg and Dubrovnik in April last year. David presented a paper and explained his perspectives for research industrial relations in a discussion with Bernd Keller. A few weeks later, he sent me an email that he might not be able to complete the planned paper. He announces that very sad moment. Dorothea Adebel, Ortrud Lestmann, Bernd and I, we have edited the interview with David, edited to the conference proceedings, and the volume is dedicated to David. I will send you a copy when I'm back in Hamburg.
Before moving on, I would just like to read a brief statement by Guglielmo Meadi, who you know as the editor of the European Journal of Industrial Relations and who could not be here today. He writes, "In numerous meetings, at conferences, and on joint teaching exchange networks, I always admired David's collegiality, commitment to teaching, and intellectual contribution to comparative employment relations. I remember 2 separate occasions in which he presented his research on France and on Germany to French and German audiences, in a sense, playing away from home. When some local researchers, in a hardly disguised attempt to protect their field, raised a number of detailed criticism, which largely missed the broader points in ways that would have pushed most to annoyed responses, David remained impeccably respectful, listening carefully, thanking for the observations, and incorporating them into his further work. I don't think I have seen better examples of graciousness in academia. Now I'd like to ask Jill Rubery, who can speak to his home field, I think.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about David. I think I first met David over 40 years ago and have much admired his work. We haven't been direct colleagues, but we intersected through our shared interest in labour market segmentation and comparative institutional analysis. David was a regular attender for many years at the International Working Party on Labour Market segmentation conferences that I have had a major responsibility for. And likewise, when I attended SASE, it was to David's network that I always submitted my papers. I was always very pleased to find he accepted them, but now I discover that he was very open and accepted most of them. So nevertheless, we've maintained that relationship. Then I wanted, first of all, to talk about the 2 ways in why, for me, David stands out as a scholar, and in the particular UK context, maybe will be difficult to replace. The first is his wide understanding of social science disciplines. It's already been mentioned. I mean, he had deep understanding of sociology, comparative institutional and political analysis, industrial relations, human resource management. In addition to his foundational discipline, economics. I think he was more I also come from an economics background, but I think having come out of a more critical tradition in Cambridge, I was perhaps more willing to sort of let go the neoclassical side, which Jérôme has commented on that he kept coming back to. But he managed to integrate all those other disciplines within and to use those disciplines to critique neoclassical economics in ways that I much admire. And he had the capacity to develop theories and empirical studies that draw on all these disciplines to create new and more integrated insights into the world of employment and work. And the second reason for his work to stand out is the depth of his knowledge and interest in all things European and comparative. His work was genuinely comparative, not for him the use of country dummies in empirical analysis to represent a country effect. And I fear that we are unlikely to see the like of David again amongst UK scholars. Even 40 years ago, before we had our research excellence framework to condition our activities, it was difficult enough to find a place for economists interested in straying beyond that discipline's ever-narrowing focus. With Brexit, I think the chances of many UK scholars following in David's European comparative footsteps is further reduced, though I am heartened by the range of young scholars at this conference. And I do feel that his efforts at inspiring young, talented scholars will still bear fruit for some time. But nevertheless, it is a risk that he is somebody who will not be replaced. Then I just wanted to say 3 points about how David has influenced my own work. There are 3 ways he's had a seminal impact, I feel. His first major book, On the End of Economic Man, which I assume is the same book as the French, was a major endeavour, as already been mentioned, to cross disciplines and consider how, in particular, how custom and practice impacted upon economic life. Eschewing the economist's maxim that custom and practice would always give way to a period of stickiness to the dictates of the market. What I particularly remember from this work and used numerous times as a key focus is that customs and institutions more generally are dynamic and a force for change, and they need to be reinterpreted and utilised as they reinterpret and utilised by actors. And they're certainly not just a historical legacy of a past era of no relevance to our understanding of the future. And a second major influence on my work is David's staunch defense of the standard employment relationship and his conceptualization of the standard employment relationship as an important social innovation. As I'm been reviewing the future of work, current future of work debate, I've become increasingly concerned by the casual way in which people talking about the next wave of technology are willing to dismiss the importance of the standard employment relationship. And particularly in the COVID experience, we see that even the most neoliberal governments suddenly realize the catastrophe that would befall if the standard employment relationship was suddenly to be ended. So I think this is also an important aspect of my own work, and I feel that David understood the relationships between the micro and macro aspects of the labour market and always tried to develop those. And that's something that I'm increasingly coming back to as an important part of what we need to do. And although we're doing this in SASE, I was struck by attending a more macro session and realising that actually there was still a lack of an understanding of the micro aspects of the labour market that David would not have fallen into. And so I think that's and then the third point is that of characteristic of David's work that I use, and here particularly in teaching, was his ability to recognise paradoxes and perverse effects. His work on teachers' experience of performance pay in the UK, I use constantly as an example, where here was a group of workers who disliked the performance incentive aspect of performance pay, but apparently enjoyed the opportunity to have a one-to-one discussion about what they were doing and what they want to do in the future. So the dislike of performance pay meant they were not incentivized by the monetary part, but actually performance rose because they enjoyed the other part. And I mention this example because I use it in teaching to demonstrate to students the inherent ambiguities and complexities in managing employment. And I feel that David fully appreciated these complexities, tensions and paradoxes, and thereby my book demonstrated his real understanding of and passion for the study of employment. And in that, I think he'll be much missed.
I have, of course, been in touch with other researchers, especially in East Asia, who would have liked to have been here. I think it's very clear that David's impact was global. I would like now to turn to those who studied and were mentored by and worked together with David, I think all of them at the London School of Economics, and we'll begin with Anke Hassel.
Yes, thank you, Karen, for inviting me to speak here. I want to make two personal remarks on how David has shaped my life. And I first met him when I came to the LSE in 1988. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Bonn. I'm a first-generation academic. I come from the countryside, from a rural place. My father was a train driver, but he was also a union activist, and I was interested in unions. And I came to the LSE, and I was very much intimidated by the LSE, by the academic environment there. And David taught me there. He was teaching the course on comparative employment relations. And I think David intuitively knew what it means to be inclusive towards students for who the academic environment was not a natural environment. He was very friendly, very open. He helped me in a number of things which might have been sort of obvious to other people, but he just struck me as someone who noticed that people have very different needs, and he was very willing to help students with very different needs. And I was struck by that, and I think that helped me a lot to find my ways in academia and also then at the LSE. The second area where he had a huge impact on me was actually in this course on comparative employment relations, because that opened a new world to me. Before I came there, I didn't even know that industrial relations existed, because it didn't exist in Germany at the time. And I never knew what the world of comparative industrial relations actually means. And he taught the course by drawing a lot of material from the French industrial sociologists. and from workplace relations. And this was an understanding of the world and of societies at that time, which was very new to me and had a huge impression. And you must remember, this was the time before varieties of capitalism, before really the whole sort of notion what it means that national societies have very different societal organizations, but also institutions that not only impact employment, but also impact the way companies operate, the way companies perform, firms perform, etc. And he was really the entry point into this huge field of comparative employment relations, and then led me to my other academic steps. Without him, I wouldn't have met Walter Müller-Jentsch, I wouldn't have met the German Industrial Relations Association, and I certainly wouldn't have ended up at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. So he was really a formative figure for my academic career, and I will never forget that.
Thank you very much, Anke. One of the ways which we're going to remember David forever is through the David Marsden Best Paper Prize of Network G. And I should have mentioned Jill Rubery was one of the jurors. Heloise Petit and her co-authors won the first prize. They decided to award honorable mention to Francis Yoon, who's not here anymore, but was joining us earlier. And also Ginny Doellgast was one of the jury members, as well as Al-Islam. And I would now like to ask Ginny Doellgast to come up.
Hello. Okay. So David was my colleague at LSE for 8 years, between 2008 and 2015. And we worked together very closely in the time that I was there. We co-taught classes, including some version of the class that Anke took, I'm sure, in many different iterations for different groups of students. We co-advised PhD students, and he was the mentor on my ESRC first grant, which led to us working together on a paper based on that research. We shared particularly our research interests. We both did comparative research on industrial relations and employment systems. We both had this interest on the macro and the micro and connecting the two. And we both had spent time both in Germany and in France. I spent some time during sabbaticals and summers at the Lust Research Institute that was mentioned by Jérôme, which is known for the societal effects school, as Jérôme said. But I can remember, that connected us in a certain way beyond the intellectual influences of the societal effects school and the colleagues we had there, because David loved the French countryside and he loved France, and his kind of love for France went well beyond what we've heard, the kind of intellectual influences or understanding industrial relations. If anyone who knows David, two of the topics that really lit him up were talking about French culture and French food and France in general, but also running. So he was very happy he could share with me his love of certain running routes through Aix-en-Provence. David and I also both were on the British Journal of Industrial Relations editorial board, and we worked together on a battle with the LSE administration to keep the journal from being sold to Wiley. So it was long owned by LSE, and there was a decision made to get out of the journal business, as the administration said. We ultimately lost that battle, but I can remember going with David together to meet with one colleague who was really the main decision maker driving the sale, and he was being quite aggressive. He was, this kind of macho university administrator, his attitude. And I got quite angry at him, and David really backed me up in his own quiet, gentle way. And then this colleague quickly de-escalated. I don't think he was used to a woman talking back to him in a sense. And he started talking about alternatives, how we might meet in the middle, how LSE could continue to support the journal. And he said, well, we'll have a period where we'll review this decision. Of course, ended up, partially failing, but getting some concessions out of it. So after the meeting, David had this kind of thoughtful look. He said, it was quite good that you got upset and told him off. That is actually a very good strategy for getting a macho university administrator to take you more seriously. And I give this example because I think it really captures something about how David had this simultaneously very gentle approach, but also quite strategic. And Bob Anke told me when I started at LSE and said, oh, you know, David, great colleague, he's so supportive. And Bob said, don't let that fool you. David and I have this like two-man show, good cop, bad cop going on. When we want to get something done, we get it done. And our different styles are useful in that sense. And Alice and I were talking about this the other night, that she agrees this is kind of a signature of David. Yes, so he had this gentle but strategic approach to getting things done. It was rooted in his own careful study of organizations and people. And I think that was also kind of a motivation in his work. He was really interested in people. He was really interested in the dynamics of organizations, understanding them. But I think that also made him a very effective organizational citizen, in a sense. And his research then also reflects this curiosity for the micro foundations of decision-making within organizations, how they involve psychology and interests. But he combines this with the comparativist sensitivity to how institutions can shape or channel these decisions. And I was asked to say something about David's research and writing. I was influenced by his book, A Theory of Employment Systems, as a PhD student. I've read many of his articles, discussed his own working papers as a colleague. But I guess I learned most about David as a comparative theorist through our collaborative work. We co-authored an article based on my research in telecom firms. And we were trying to explain differences in performance management practices in call centers that were owned by major telecom firms in the UK, France, Denmark, and Germany, and developed this model of how different combinations of institutional constraints like job security and participation resources supporting worker voice, like co-determination rights in Germany, really shaped what could be called 4 different employment systems in his traditional reading, or different approaches to motivating and disciplining workers. And I started out when we were talking about, well, how do we model or explain these different patterns of outcomes we see of HR systems? I was pushing this kind of static lens around, well, there's beneficial constraints on managers preventing monitoring, and other ways of thinking about how institutions were really kind of pushing managers to then work together with unions. But David's first intuition was to focus on performance standards. He started with Mintzberg's arguments from the 70s on coordination through standardization or mutual adjustments. He was like, we need to bring in Simon, right? His theorization of the employment relationship is based on a deal where employees accept management's right to direct their labor. And so our different starting points became a framework that really brought together these ideas. And so I say David was a really fun person to co-author with, because he was so interested in, again, has been saying already, sort of meeting people halfway, thinking about, well, what do I learn from your approach, but what do I bring from my own intellectual history and influences? And so the last communication I had with David was an email exchange over my book based on this comparative telecom study that our articles was based on. He wrote back. When I was writing this, I started crying. I was afraid this was going to happen. It's inevitable. So he wrote back. He was enthusiastic as always, but he let me know that it may take him a while to read the draft, because he had been diagnosed with cancer and was going to be starting treatment, and he passed away less than 2 months later. So I miss David very much. He made a lasting impact on my own life and work, and I know of many others here. So rest in power, David.
There's one more person from his LSE satellite who has been organizing tributes herself and is organizing a conference and a special issue for David. As you can guess, that's Sarah Ashwin.
Deep breath. Yeah. Well, thank you, Ginny, and everyone for those beautiful tributes. Actually, I would like to begin by just, with condolences, especially to Alice and Anthony and to all David's close friends, because I think the anniversary of David's death will obviously be an emotional moment. So, deep condolences. It's so, tragic. We can't sugarcoat that. But as Karen said, it is also a celebration. So in celebration of David's work, I just want to advertise that there is a BJR special issue. It's just gone live, the call for papers. So the deadline for the extended abstract is the 17th of October, and the conference will be held at LSE in June 2023. So we're really excited to receive your contributions to that. I'm not going to talk now about David's work, but I do think that the one thing I want to say is that David was such an original scholar, and that's why I'm really excited about this special issue, because a lot of you have picked up on the fact that David was really scholarly in his deep reading across disciplines, sociology, economics, and what that meant was that his work kind of always stood inside and outside academic fashion. Outside, because he was always informed by this dialogue between classic and a new thinking, which enabled him to come up with really original theories, but also because he was thinking about what was going on in the world, it meant that he came up with really timely contributions. So I was reflecting on this, thinking, wow, so his, End of Economic Man comes out within a year of Granovetter's embeddedness, problem of embeddedness, and I think that's, significant. And then Theory of Employment Systems is, a couple of years before Varieties of Capitalism, the big book. So he obviously had, he was in tune with the zeitgeist, but in a sense also outside it with his own deeply original take. So I'm excited for the special issue because I think there's lots of things we can take forward in that. But I wanted to talk about David, the LSE man. So Alice has actually commented that David was, in a sense, married to LSE. He did really love, as well as to Alice, of course. But he did really love LSE as an institution. He was devoted to his students, to his PhD students, to the institution itself, and to other faculty. He was a really dedicated teacher of, for many years, comparative employment relations and comparative HRM. I found your tribute, Anke, really touching, and it just shows how his teaching of that subject has really inspired generations of scholars. Working on that. But his last teaching assignment at LSE was actually a course that he designed and ran on negotiations. And he was so proud of this course. And in fact, in 2018, he won an LSE prize for his teaching on this course. It went really well. The students loved it. And in fact, he was working on this course. He was improving it, in weeks before his death, he was working on what he was going to do the following year. So he was a really dedicated teacher. He's also, as you've heard, was very dedicated to his PhD students. He was a key instigator of the European Doctoral Network, which has been really influential in lots of students' academic journeys, which was very, very important. Meanwhile, at LSE, as you would imagine, he was an absolutely outstanding citizen. So he was on LSE Council, and he was also held the role of Vice Chair of the Academic Board. So the kind of LSE does retain some kind of democratic ethos, and David was one of the people who contributed to keeping that alive. So he kind of lived out his values in practice, I would say, in that sense. And he also did that within our department. I is now a Department of Management. When I joined, and as for David, it was a Department of Industrial Relations. As you can imagine, it was not necessarily an easy process for, putting 4 departments together. But David was just really, as everyone has said, he was steadfast, but also willing to compromise. So I would storm into his office and say, David, do you know what they've done now? Oh my God, And he would say, put his head on one side and go, no, and come up with some benign interpretation and try to work through it. And it was really very effective. And in fact, our professoriate, I have to say, can be a difficult environment at times. But the tributes from fellow professors for David when he died just emphasise what a difference having him on that in the professoriate made. So one of them said, he made all of us ever so slightly better, ever so slightly kinder through the example he set. And I think that's absolutely right. And another one said that he tried to make everyone else even better. So this sense that he was always working with people. So I feel that David exemplified the values that we need more than ever today. Things like decency, probity, incorruptibility, willingness to listen to the other side in arguments, and above all, kindness. So I think David was a giant. As people have said, he is irreplaceable, but I think we can do our best to follow his example. Thank you.
We'll now move closer to home, to the immediate SASE community. And as I mentioned, David, with Alex Hicks, founded the Socio-Economic Review. And for a decade, Gregory Jackson has led it. He's outgoing editor, and I asked him to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for the opportunity to say a little bit about David. I was not maybe his closest colleague of like direct collaboration, co-author, or working together at LSE, but we were both in SASE for a long time, and it's been said about his role as network organizer. I came to my first SASE meeting in 1996, and I've been to every meeting ever since then, and always, you go somewhere else in the world and you're confused and you're going to the executive council meeting and where is it? And it's in some building. And then, I'd see David. I'm like, okay, I'm in the right place. And that was always a great comfort, the moment of seeing him there. And I suppose I followed a bit in David's footsteps. So he was the first founding editor of Socio-Economic Review. He was not the actual founder, or at least according to Alex Hicks, it was the SASE executive, but he and Alex were the first editors. And I went back a couple of years ago to read the inaugural editorial of SER and what Alex and David wrote. With the review, we launch an enterprise that we hope will address and create dialogue among a wide and inclusive range of the various communities interested in the economy. So very broad. When you look at the inaugural issue, the first article that they put as the lead article of SCR was by Peter Abel on the prospects of a unified social science, economics, and sociology. There was an article by Amatai in there toward a socioeconomic paradigm. And if you kind of look in that article, it became very clear to me that one of the kind of intentions of SCR in that time was to create really a dialogue of, everybody else and economics as a discipline, right? And it was like, okay, let's kind of open up economics and create this kind of space, but in which economics was the kind of core. So there's just two things I want to say about it. First of all, and I don't think it's been said that David's like an entrepreneur and a serial entrepreneur, that he's founded and initiated several journals. And I think this kind of journal, particularly maybe slightly more so than the industrial relations ones, like in Germany that were mentioned, it was a pretty risky kind of like venture. Like is this going to go anywhere? And this young association kind of put a big bet of its future that this journal would take off. I think the journal did take off thanks to David and Alex. They just got great papers and great people who worked at these fringes. So really couldn't, I think SASE wouldn't be where it is without the journal, and the journal wouldn't be without that kind of foundation that he laid that made it, very easy for those coming after to kind of, ride the wave that the journal already had. But I'd just like to go a little bit back to the spirit of this dialogue with economics and examine this a little bit. So David was an economist. I think he was proud of that, and he identified in that. Hayek said, no great economist as only an economist, right? And I was trying to think, well, has this dialogue of disciplines, or the dialogue with economics specifically, been achieved? And it's kind of interesting because I think it's totally not been achieved at all, right? And probably from this founding idea, in a way you couldn't have anticipated where SASE is now, or I think it was maybe where we went was not really clear. Why is that? I don't know. The behavioral turn in economics, I think economics turned much more to sort of psychology, experiments, sort of methodological rigor, causation, isolating and narrowing of topics, in my view. And, we see simultaneously the rise of economic sociology, which, from the Granovetter onwards, which has not been received at all in economics. I think nobody knows about it or pays, much kind of attention to it. And what's the kind of difference? Why isn't that dialogue taking place? So if you see economics as kind of narrowing and going more into the inwards of the human brain and decision making and cognition and brain science and so forth, where SASE is gone is a little bit more out, right? And it's really very much about context and creating, I think that was David's vision of, keeping that core of economics, but bringing in those contextual factors. And lots been said about his, comparative work and all those connections. So I won't repeat that, but I think, it's not an accident that he learned so many languages and spoke them well. And, for him, meaning was very important. And at the same time, in his masterful book, which has also been mentioned, The Theory of Employment Systems, you have Coase and Simon, and you have information and all your economic foundations. And then you have, just in that kind of very gentle way that David would write, the focus on legitimacy. Well, what's legitimacy? That's about what's socially acceptable. It's about morals. It's about meanings. It's chock full of cultural content, which he put kind of, married together in his theory. So David, I think, achieved that dialogue, and it's, very interesting just to see, I think. But I think if we look at the legacy he left at SCR, even if we didn't achieve that conversation with economics in the way that he maybe envisioned 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road, I do think that the journal is a place where we do have interdisciplinarity and lots of, really cool conversations going on across many different other disciplines, political science and anthropology, law, and so forth. So I hope in a modest way the journal, I think it very continues his, there's an expression in the study of entrepreneurship about, imprinting, and that the imprint of the founders on the organization. And I think in this ethos, we can still really see that. So thank you, David, for, laying that foundation for all of us.
Gregory and I are sociologists. Network G is one of the places where we have an extremely interdisciplinary group of scholars. And I was very concerned that we recruit an economist to help me run the Network G in the way that David has done for so many years. And Uschi Bacchus-Gellner, who's at every meeting running panels, has pledged her support. And I'm happy to announce that Martin Schneider, who's sitting here, has agreed to become co-coordinator. So we're going to do the best we can to make sure that Network G goes forward in the spirit of David's work. When you're running a network, the person who you have the most contact with is in back, Pat Sraidi, and she's a very modest person, but I just wanted to signal that she has probably had more contact with David than any of us over the many years. Also because it's one of the biggest networks, there was a lot to organize, and I know how much he appreciated her work, and I know how great your loss was too, Pat. But our last word goes to Martha Zuber, who also had very intensive contact with David over many years as he was president and editor and coordinator of one of the big networks, and also from the Francophile.
I think Jérôme has said it all. I mean, David and I...
We have to give you a microphone because, yeah.
You know, in Yiddish, we have an expression. It's called a mensch. David was a mensch. And Pat and I adored working with him. And David and I shared a passion, and that was France. And I was always so jealous because I've lived in France for many, many decades. He spoke French without an accent. And I've been there so long, and I have a terrible accent. So we always talked about France, and I also went on the memorable, did you go on that cruise in Chicago, the architectural? But we loved working with David, and we're going to miss him enormously. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Is there anybody else who would like to say something? I know that Alice would like the last word. And I think I will ask Alice to say something. And yes. And then I would suggest that we just all stand up and gather around because you may want to say something personally. So, yeah.
I'm actually not on the program, but I feel that I ought to say. Thank you. When we met the other day, I made a joke to Sarah, saying that David was married to the London School of Economics for 40 years. He then took on SASE as his concubine, and I'm the other concubine. I just wanted to thank Karen for organizing this very special tribute session for David, and for all the speakers for their extremely touching and generous tributes to him. David was a devoted husband and father, but above all, he was a totally dedicated scholar. And he was ever so proud of his affiliation with SASE for over 3 decades. The London School of Economics and SASE were the twin pillars of David's intellectual life. SASE was founded in 1989, the year David and I got married. And I believed that he was involved right from the beginning at Harvard, together with Azioni. Therefore, his affiliation with SASE was as long as our marriage, possibly a couple of months longer than our marriage. I myself started attending SASE, I think in 1991. Anthony was dragged along with us when he was age 0 in a pushchair. And the poor little chap had to endure SASE until he was a teenager and was able to say, absolutely no, I don't want to come. But this time, he wanted to come with me to join us in remembering the work and the activities of David and meeting all his friends and colleagues. It is comforting for Anthony and I to know that David lived a fulfilling professional life, supported by so many wonderful friends and colleagues. And can tell you that he was an extremely content, happy, and positive person till the last day. I think I told Sarah about this. After he died, during the last couple of weeks when he was receiving treatment, he was still working. He had his Kindle and a notebook. And after he died, I look at the last page of his Kindle. He was looking at a case study for the course of bargaining analysis. And the last page on his notebook was organizing the sections for last year's SASE. So he was ultimately a dedicated scholar more than anything else. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming here today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alice. And you know you have a permanent home in SASE. You're a scholar who's contributed a great deal to our organization, and we welcome you back again and again and again. And I would suggest we close just by having a very loud round of applause for David Marsden in his memory and his contributions.